By way of warning as to the consequences of betraying the order, the initiate took part in a ceremony during which he was warned, quote, "If you are only a traitor and perjurer, learn that all our brothers are called upon to arm themselves against you. Do not hope to escape or find a place of safety. Wherever you are, shame, remorse, and the rage of our brothers will pursue you and torment you to the innermost recesses of your entrails." Close quote. Weishaupt had a subtle but clear-cut plan to destroy religion. Quote, "I've contrived an explanation which has every advantage, is inviting to Christians of every communion, gradually frees them from all religious prejudices, cultivates the social virtues, and animates them by a great, a feasible, a speedy prospect of universal happiness in a state of liberty and moral equity, freed from the obstacles which subordination, rank, and riches continually throw in our way. My explanation is accurate and complete. My means are effectual and irresistible. Our secret association works in a way that nothing can withstand, and man shall soon be free and happy." Close quote. This plan proved extremely successful, not only with the novices, but with men of all ranks and ages. Weishaupt wrote, quote, "The most admirable thing of all is that great Protestant and Reformed theologians, Lutherans and Calvinists who belong to our order, really believe that they see in it the true and genuine mind of the Christian religion. The Protestant princes and rulers of Germany and Europe were pleased with Weishaupt's plan to destroy the Catholic Church. Therefore, they sought to join the order. These men brought with them control of the Masonic order, into which they initiated Weishaupt and his co-conspirators in 1777. To prevent the rulers from realizing the true purpose of the Illuminati, Weishaupt limited them to the lower degrees. The Illuminati broadens its outreach. In 1830, Adam Weishaupt died at the age of 82. In an effort to convince the world that Illuminism was dead and no longer a threat, he reportedly made an impressive deathbed repentance and rejoined the Catholic Church. In 1834, Giuseppe Mazzini, the Italian revolutionary leader, was appointed by the Illuminati as director of the revolutionary program around the world. He held this position until he died in 1872. At about this time, an obscure intellectual by the name of Moses Mordecai Marx Levy, alias Karl Marx, joined one of the branch organizations of the Illuminati conspiracy known as the League of the Just. In 1847, he was hired to write what became known as the Communist Manifesto. Basically, it was a policy statement of their overall plans for the future. Marx was of such little importance that for the first 20 years after the publication of the manifesto, his name didn't even appear on it. He was just a pawn in the game being played by the power brokers behind the scenes. Honest historians have long recognized that the Communist Manifesto was a plagiarized rehash of the writings of Adam Weishaupt and his disciples. The thought that there have been people actually planning the major events of the future in a harmful way has often been expressed by some of the world's leaders. One such individual was Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of England during World War II. He wrote about what he had discovered when he made his views public in a London newspaper in 1920, quote, "From the days of Spartacus to Weishaupt, to those of Karl Marx, to those of Trotsky, Bela Kuhn, Rosa Luxemburg, and Emma Goldman, this worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization and for the reconstitution of society on the basis of arrested development, of envious malevolence and impossible equality has been steadily growing. It played a definitely recognizable role in the tragedy of the French Revolution. It has been the mainspring of every subversive movement during the 19th century, and now at last this band of extraordinary personalities from the underworld of the great cities of Europe and America have gripped the Russian people by the hair of their heads and have become practically the undisputed masters of that enormous empire," close quote. Mr. Churchill linked Weishaupt and the Illuminati of 1776 with the communist Karl Marx of 1848, and Marx with the Russian communists of 1917. It was his opinion that these individuals had been linked together in a conspiracy lasting for more than 140 years. He then combined this conspiracy with European and American revolutionaries, and his final comment was that their combined purpose was to overthrow civilization. In other words, Mr. Churchill claimed that their purpose was to bring the world a quote-unquote new world order. He told the world that this conspiracy wanted to overthrow civilization. Karl Marx, probably never in history has such a deceptive folklore surrounded a figure as that which continues to encircle the legend of Karl Marx, co-author of the Communist Manifesto and celebrated father of communism. Even if we read about Marx in a typical modern encyclopedia, we get a confusing picture of him. He's usually painted in glowing terms, such as the quote-unquote founder of democratic socialism. However, there is recent evidence that Marx was far less interested in the common man than he was in doing the bidding of secret societies. Though not widely known, Marx was a Satanist. In his student years, Marx authored a little-known drama, Ulanem, Oulanem, Ulanem, a story showing a twisted mind, to say the very least. Modern communists and socialists have gone to great lengths to suppress this telling literary creation of the young Marx. We may never know why Marx turned against Christianity, but what is blatantly obvious is that the young Karl Marx had been initiated into a satanic cult. In his poem called The Player, which was later downplayed by both himself and his followers, he wrote, quote, "The hellish vapors rise and fill the brain, till I go mad and my heart is utterly changed. See the sword? The prince of darkness sold it to me. For he beats the time and gives the signs. Even more boldly, I play the dance of death." Close quote. Obviously, Marx had gone beyond the more innocuous-seeming Luciferian stages of initiation and had already accepted the philosophies of Satanism. According to Reverend Richard Warmbrand, an author who has written extensively on the subject of Karl Marx, he had become an avowed enemy of all gods to, quote, draw all mankind into the abyss and to follow them laughing, close quote. In 1843, he married and moved to Paris to, quote, study French communism. There he met Friedrich Engels, a young German radical who was wealthy. He was the wealthy son of a textile manufacturer. It is ironic that the two relatively wealthy young radicals wrote the Communist Manifesto. Engels was the political product of the communist rabbi Moses Hess. Hess wrote after meeting Engels, quote, "He parted from me as an overzealous communist. This is how I produce ravages," close quote. Marx and Engels hoped to transform all of Europe into flaming revolution, from which would spring not representative government of, by, and for the people, but a dictatorship by Satanists. The rivals of Marx and Engels were aware of this and pointed it out during the course of struggling for power. Wurmbrand wrote of Marx's motivations, quote, "He had no vision of serving mankind, the proletariat, or socialism. He merely wished to bring the world to ruin, to build for himself a throne whose bulwark would be human fear," close quote. Wurmbrand states that Marx was a Satanist before he became a communist. In other words, the communism for which he was later credited was simply the best way to dupe the rest of the population into abandoning the church and following the course mapped out by Weishaupt more than 60 years earlier. Quote, "There is no support for the view that Marx entertained lofty social ideas about helping mankind. On the contrary, Marx hated any notion of God or gods. He was determined by the man, He was determined to be the man to kick God out. All this before he had embraced socialism, which was only the bait to entice proletarians and intellectuals to embrace this devilish ideal," close quote. Marx's political philosophy is so full of holes that it cannot stand much scrutiny. For example, the very foundation of Marx's communist theory is that society is on an inevitable course of development from capitalism to socialism to communism. Marx and Engels said of capitalism in the Communist Manifesto, quote, its fail and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable, close quote. If it is inevitable, why did he see violence as a necessity? According to Marx, quote, there is but one way of simplifying, shortening, concentrating the death and agony of the old society, as well as the bloody labor of the New World's birth. Revolutionary terror, close quote. Of course, Marx was not the only Satanist of his day who professed communism for political gain. In fact, many of his friends were of like mind. Mikhail Bakunin, Bakunin, the Russian anarchist, admitted the direct connection between socialist revolutions and Satanism. Quote, the evil one is the satanic revolt against divine authority, revolt in which we see the reckoned germ of all human emancipations, the revolution. Satan is the eternal rebel, the first free thinker and emancipator of worlds. He makes men ashamed of his bestial ignorance and obedience. He emancipates him, stamps upon his brow the seal of liberty and humanity, in urging him to disobey and eat of the fruit of knowledge, close quote. Bakunin, who was also a member of Russian nobility, goes on to explain that the true nature of revolutions is not to free the poor from exploitation, but to, quote, awaken the devil in the people, to stir up the basest passions. Our mission is to destroy, not to edify, close quote. Although Marx went on to win worldly acclaim, the personal price for him was high. He suffered from frequent illnesses, and even when physically healthy, endured long periods of depression that he claimed prevented him from working. He drank heavily and taught his children to do likewise. In one letter to Engels, begging for more money, he explained, quote, the children appear to have inherited their father's lust for drink from their father, close quote. Marx's daughter Laura and her husband, the socialist Lafargue, committed suicide together. Marx's favorite daughter, Eleanor, married the Satanist Edward Eveling, who lectured on such subjects as, quote unquote, the wickedness of God. They too made a suicide pact. She died, he backed out at the last minute. Karl Marx and his enduring legacy. The thing that changed Marx's views about life was the fact that he had discovered the world of Satan worship. There is evidence that he joined a satanic cult headed by Joanna Southcott, a satanic priestess who considered herself to be in contact with a demon named Shiloh. One of the distinguishing characteristics of his membership in this cult was his long hair and unkempt beard. Another notable communist, Nikolai Lenin, the father of the Communist Revolution in 1917 in Russia, also voiced his hatred of God and revolution. He wrote the following comments, quote, Atheism is an integral part of Marxism. But I will say it again. He wrote the following comments, quote, Atheism is an integral part of Marxism. Marxism is materialism. We must combat religion, close quote. Quote, we of course say that we do not believe in God. We do not believe in eternal morality. That is moral, that serves the destruction of the old society. Everything is moral, which is necessary for the annihilation of the old exploiting social order. Lenin wished to destroy the old world order and replace it with the new world order, and for the uniting of the proletariat, close quote. Quote, we must combat religion. Down with religion. Long live atheism. The spread of atheism is our chief task. Communism abolishes eternal truths. It abolishes all religion and morality, close quote. Quote, religion is a kind of spiritual intoxicant in which the slaves of capital drown their humanity and blunt their desire for decent human experience. We shall always preach a scientific philosophy. We must fight against the inconsistencies of the Christians, close quote. Lenin, like Marx before him, came from a religious family. His father was a school inspector and a devout member of the Russian Orthodox Church. But at the age of 18, Lenin started reading Karl Marx and soon was expounding Marxist philosophies. He later wrote, quote, "Atheism is a natural and inseparable portion of Marxism, of the theory and practice of scientific socialism. Our propaganda necessarily includes propaganda for atheism," close quote. Other communists have joined the attack on religion. Nikita Khrushchev, a Soviet dictator who preached the communist theology during the time he spent at the top of the Russian government, wrote, quote, "Do not think that the communists have changed their minds about religion. We remain the atheists that we always have been. We are doing as much as we can to liberate those people who are still under the spell of this religious opiate," close quote. But notice that Mr. Khrushchev went one step further than some of the other atheists. He stated that the task of the communist atheists was to, quote unquote, liberate the God-fearers from their God. This obviously is the task not only of the communists, but of the New World Order. Others more recently have praised Marxism. One who served in a high administrative position inside President Jimmy Carter's cabinet was Zbigniew Brzezinski, the special assistant to the president for national security affairs. In 1970, Mr. Brzezinski wrote a book entitled Between Two Ages, in which he made some startling observations on the nature of Marxism. Quote, "Marxism represents a further vital and creative stage in the maturing of man's universal vision," close quote. Quote, "Marxism is simultaneously a victory of the external active man over the inner passive man, and a victory of reason over belief," close quote. Quote, "Marxism has served as a mechanism of human progress, even if its practice has often fallen short of its ideals," close quote. Quote, "What will probably remain the major contribution of Marxism, its revolutionary and broadening influence, which opened man's mind to previously ignored perspectives and dramatized previously neglected concerns," close quote. Quote, "Marxism, disseminated on the popular level in the form of communism, represented a major advance in man's ability to conceptualize his relationship to the world," close quote. Quote, "Marxism provided a unique intellectual tool for understanding and harnessing the fundamental forces of our time. It supplied the best available insight into contemporary reality," close quote. There is a saying, "If you are not a communist when you are young, you have no heart. If you are one when you are old, you have no head." Communism works only on paper and is often the ideological and philosophical dream of the naive college student. Brzezinski embraces this ideology as an experienced world figure, former head of the National Security Council, reporting directly to Jimmy Carter, and co-founder of the Trilateral Commission. The Rothschild omission. By the middle of the 1800s, when Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto, the common dictum of Europe was, quote, "There is only one power in Europe, and that is Rothschild," close quote. Hidden, the invisibility of the Rothschilds is not accidental. It has been carefully cultivated through the years. Though they control scores of industrial, commercial, mining, and tourist corporations, not one bears the name Rothschild. The question remains to be answered whether the Rothschilds were secret financiers behind the Illuminati, the consequent French Revolution, and the Jacobin influence in the United States. Certainly the Rothschilds' influence upon industrial America was profound. Working through the Wall Street firms Kuhn, Loeb and Company and J.P. Morgan Company, the Rothschilds financed John D. Rockefeller so that he could create the Standard Oil empire. They also financed the railroad activities of Edward Harriman and the steel business transactions of Andrew Carnegie. By the beginning of the 1900s, the wealth of the now invisible House of Rothschild had grown to such proportions that it was estimated that they controlled half of the wealth of the world. Historian Nesta Webster asked the natural question of Marx's omission. Quote, now how is it conceivable that a man who set out to honestly denounce capitalism should have avoided all reference to its principal authors? How are we to explain this astounding omission? Only by recognizing that Marx was not sincere in his denunciations of the capitalistic system and that he had other ends in view, close quote. Although their methods were apparently different, the source of their ideas was the same. Marx, however, eventually became too radical, even for the Italian head of the Illuminati. Mazzini was one of the few who maintained a friendship with Marx throughout his life. Mazzini, a murderer in his own right, said that Marx had a quote-unquote destructive spirit. His heart burst with hatred rather than with love towards men, close quote. It is interesting to note that during the last years of his life, Marx undertook to learn the Russian language as though privy to the eventual direction communism would take. He died on March 14th, 1883 in London and was buried in Highgate Cemetery, which has since become the center of British Satanism. Mysterious rites of black magic are still celebrated at Marx's tomb. The Soviet Revolution. The next great project of secret societies was to prepare the conquest of Europe via the creation of what would later become the Soviet Union. Revolution in Russia was germinating through the 1880s, but did not break out until the beginning of the 1900s. By 1905, a premature attempt at revolution broke out in the streets of St. Petersburg and Moscow. Although the revolution was soon crushed, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to establish an elected parliament called the Duma. The Tsar jailed or exiled an estimated 250,000 revolutionaries, including Lenin, who went to Switzerland. Lenin's accomplice, Leon Trotsky, real name was Bronstein, was arrested in 1905. By 1907, he had escaped from prison and eventually made his way to France, where he was soon expelled for his revolutionary activities there. Before he left, he founded a Bolshevik newspaper called The Voice. He ended up in New York in January 1917, where he went to work as a reporter for a communist newspaper called The New World. It was in New York that Trotsky discovered that the quote-unquote revolution had powerful American friends. He soon discovered that there were wealthy Wall Street bankers who were willing to finance a revolution in Russia. Within 2 months, Trotsky left New York to return to Russia. But this time he had with him a fortune in gold and even an entourage of 275 dedicated revolutionaries, many of them Americans who aided him. Trotsky ended up in jail in Canada for inflammatory speech. And who intervened to free Trotsky and his gold from the Canadian jail? None other than President Woodrow Wilson's closest White House advisor, Colonel House, the man who later helped create America's Federal Reserve Bank. And he was said to have the complete trust of the Rothschilds. Within only a few days, Trotsky was provided with an American passport and he sailed on to Russia. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks stormed the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, and another monarchy was overthrown. The model of revolution was youthful and working. In 1922, a terrible famine hit Russia, and in that year alone, 5 million Russians starved to death, almost 3 times as many as died in World War I. Lenin had to admit that Marxism as an economic system was a failure. He instituted a radical economic reform. He eliminated the Marxist barter system and returned currency and wages to the Russian people. In less than a year, 3/4 of all retail distribution was in private hands. Peasant farmers were allowed to sell most of their grain on the open market. In a matter of months, starvation began to disappear. In the end, Lenin finally understood the consequences of his actions. In 1924, from his deathbed, Lenin said, quote, "I committed a great error. My nightmare is to have the feeling that I'm lost in an ocean of blood from the innumerable victims It is too late to return. To save our country, Russia, we would have needed men like Francis of Assisi. With 10 men like him, we would have saved Russia, close quote. By 1924, Lenin was dead, and his assistant Joseph Stalin used his extremely ruthless tactics to take control of the nation. Stalin began wiping out the prosperous independent businessmen and peasant farmers who had flourished under the later days of Lenin's rule. Again, Russia was plunged into starvation, now ruled by one of the most dictatorial and murderous tyrants the world had ever known. Whole cities were wiped out at the hint of rebellion to his iron-fisted rule. It is now estimated by Soviet sources that Stalin's reign of terror killed 40 million Russians, many times the number slaughtered by Hitler, who financed Lenin and Trotsky. The evidence points to a variety of European and American financiers. One German responsible for financing of the Bolshevik Revolution was Max Warburg, the brother of American Paul Warburg, the prime mover in establishing the U.S. Federal Reserve System. Max ran a Rothschild-allied family bank in Frankfurt, Germany, and was the head of the German secret police during World War I. Paul Warburg had another brother named Felix. It was Felix's father-in-law, Jacob Schiff, who seems to have been a main co-conspirator in the United States. Schiff was senior partner in the Wall Street investing firm of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. According to the New York Journal American of February 3rd, 1949, it was estimated by Jacob's grandson, John Schiff, that the quote-unquote old man sank about $20 million for the final triumph of Bolshevism in Russia. An interesting note on how political power and financial power commingle. Vice President Al Gore's daughter, Corinna, married the great-grandson of Jacob Schiff. Other Westerners who helped finance the Bolsheviks were J.P. Morgan and Company, the Rockefeller oil family, and Alfred Milner Rothschild. The White Russian general Arseny de Gulevich confirmed the Western financing of the Soviet Revolution years later when he identified Jacob Schiff as a longtime supporter of the quote-unquote Russian revolutionary cause. The general also claimed that, quote, over 21 million rubles were donated to the cause by Lord Milner, close quote. Since then, American financiers have striven mightily to keep communism alive. According to Gary Allen, quote, virtually everything the Soviets possess has been acquired from the West. It is not much of an exaggeration to say that the USSR was made in the USA, close quote. And what was the cost to the Russian people? By 1920, industrial production had dropped to only 13% of the 1913 figure. That was an almost complete lack of clothing, There was almost a complete lack of clothing, shoes, and agricultural products. The ruble became almost worthless. The Russian price index of that day rose more than 16,000 times between 1917 and 1920. Crop yields fell from 74 million tons in 1916 to 30 million tons in 1920. The situation was exacerbated in 1920 with a drought and subsequent famine. It is estimated that in 1920 and 1921, 5 million people died of famine alone. With the ascendancy of Joseph Stalin as the leader of communist Russia, barbarism reached new highs. In 1945, 12 years after the end of Stalin's first 5-year plan, he told Winston Churchill that during that period, 12 million peasants died in the reorganization of agriculture alone. The fox with the new coat, but still a fox. Throughout the 20th century, the international implementation of the Great Plan for a New World became much more sophisticated, disguising itself behind a variety of advanced financial, political, and social engineering schemes. Protected from exposure by an increasingly subservient press, secret societies made dramatic strides toward establishing their new world order. In the United States, the political activities of those organizations were hidden under layer after layer of scholarly association and large financial foundations. Their domestic activities focused on gaining control of the American banking system and remaking the educational system to their plans. On the financial front, the top priority became the creation of a central banking system in America. The Rothschild banking family of Europe had learned years earlier that by controlling the credit of a nation, you control its economy. Carroll Quigley, professor from Georgetown, Princeton, and Harvard universities, wrote in the book Tragedy and Hope, quote, "The history of the last century shows that the advice given to government by bankers was consistently good for bankers, but was often disastrous for governments, businessmen, and the people generally. Such advice could be enforced, if necessary, by manipulation of exchanges, gold flows, discount rates, and even levels of business activity," close quote. Karl Marx certainly understood the importance of centralizing controls on credit and other monetary policies. The Communist Manifesto calls for, quote, "the centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with an exclusive monopoly," close quote. Lenin said that the establishment of a central bank was 90% of communizing a country. These central banks are actually owned as private corporations. The Bank of England, Bank of France, and Bank of Germany were not owned by their respective governments, as almost everyone imagines, but by privately owned monopolies granted by heads of state, usually in return for loans. Certainly, the bankers involved in nationalization schemes were well aware of the power of a central bank. Blah, blah, blah. Certainly, the bankers involved in nationalization schemes were well aware of the power a central bank gave them and the outcry which would ensue if the public ever became aware of it. For example, Reginald McKenna, Chancellor of the Exchequer, Exchequer, Exchequer of England in 1915, and chairman of the board of the Midlands Bank of England, told his stockholders in January 1924, quote, "I am afraid the ordinary citizen will not like to be told that the banks can and do create money, and they who control credit of a nation direct the policy of governments and hold in the hollow of their hands the destiny of the people," close quote. The same plan for controlling the banks in Europe was brought to the U.S., and in time it succeeded. They chipped away at the laws until the Central Bank of the Federal Reserve was created in 1913. In 1832, President Andrew Jackson killed the Bank of the United States by vetoing a bill. The next year, he withdrew U.S. funds from it completely, saying, quote, "You are a den of thieves, vipers. I intend to root you out. By the eternal God, I will root you out," close quote. He stated that the bank was a, quote, "money power and a monopoly which, quote, the rich and powerful use to their exclusive advantage. In addition, he stated, quote, "Many of our rich men have besought us to make them richer by acts of Congress. By attempting to gratify their desires, we have pitted interest against interest and man against man in a fearful commotion which threatens to shake the foundations of our union," close quote. President Jackson openly accused the bank of meddling in politics by granting loans to congressmen to influence legislation, and said that this amounted to a quote-unquote bold effort to control the government. Supporters of the bank were angered by Jackson's veto of a renewal of the bank's charter after it passed both houses of Congress in the summer of 1832. Lincoln perceived the corrupting influence of the international bankers and commented, quote, "I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. Corporations have been enthroned. An era of corruption in high places will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until the wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic destroyed," close quote. Behind every social and political upheaval is a group trying to control the nation through a central bank. The Blueprint for America. In the year 1949, George Orwell wrote in his classic novel 1984. In 1949, George Orwell wrote his classic novel 1984. In it, he portrayed the same quote-unquote futuristic scenes that now lie before us as we sit in our time machine. Orwell describes the world of the future as being divided into three regions called Oceania, Eurasia, and East Asia. Oceania consists of the Americas plus England, Australia, and the Pacific Islands. Eurasia is Russia and continental Europe. East Asia comprises China, Japan, Southeast Asia, and India. These superstates are constantly at war with each other. The wars are not fought to conquer the enemy. They are waged for the primary purpose of controlling the population. The people in all three territories tolerate the misery and oppression because sacrifices are necessary in time of war. Most of the stratagems outlined in the book that shaped policy, the report from Iron Mountain, are found in Orwell's narrative. The report from Iron Mountain came from a think tank established in the early 1960s to review the nature of America's future based upon the past models of preceding civilizations. The intent was to discover how to control the American people and bring them into a manageable state. War, finance, famine, social and political concerns, and hundreds of other elements were analyzed, and it was determined that subjection of a population is the only way to have order. War must be constant to control population size. It was denied that the Iron Mountain meetings ever took place, but John Kenneth Galbraith admitted he spent time on the project. The New York Times wrote in the late 1960s about the project's actual existence. The think tank was even willing to credit Orwell as the source of some of its concepts. For example, on the subject of establishing a modern, sophisticated form of slavery, the group at Iron Mountain said, quote, "Up to now, this has been suggested only in fiction, notably in the works of Wells, Huxley, Orwell, and others engaged in the imaginative anticipation of the sociology of the future. But the fantasies projected in Huxley's Brave New World in 1984 are more plausible over the years since their publication. The traditional association of slavery exclusively with ancient pre-industrial cultures should not blind us to its adaptability to advanced forms of social organization." Close quote. From this, we see that Orwell's work is far more than an entertaining novel. It is relevant to our present journey in time. This is what he wrote, quote, "These three superstates are permanently at war and have been so for the past 25 years. War, however, is no longer the desperate, annihilating struggle that it was in the early decades of the 20th century. This is not to say that either the conduct of the war or the prevailing attitude toward it has become less bloodthirsty or more chivalrous. On the contrary, war hysteria is continuous and universal in all countries, and such acts as raping, looting, the slaughter of children, the reduction of whole populations to slavery, and reprisals against prisoners which extend even to boiling and burying alive are looked upon as normal. The primary aim of modern warfare is to use up the products of the machine without raising the general standard of living. The machine is society's technical and industrial capacity to produce goods. From the moment when the machine first made its appearance, it was clear to all thinking people that the need for human drudgery, and therefore to a great extent for human inequality, had disappeared. If the machine were used deliberately for that end, hunger, overwork, dirt, illiteracy, and disease could be eliminated within a few generations. But it was also clear that an all-around increase in wealth threatened the destruction, indeed in some cases was the destruction, of a hierarchical society. In a world in which everyone worked short hours, had enough to eat, lived in a house with a bathroom and a refrigerator, and possessed a motor car or even an airplane, the most obvious and perhaps the most important form of inequality would already have disappeared. If it once became general, wealth would confer no distinction. Such a society could not remain stable for long. For if leisure and security were enjoyed by all alike, the great mass of human beings who are normally stupefied by poverty would become literate and would learn to think for themselves. And when once they had done this, they would sooner or later realize that the privileged minority had no function, and they would sweep it away. In the long run, a hierarchical society was only possible on a basis of poverty and ignorance. The essential act of war is destruction, not necessarily of human lives, but of the products of human labor. War is a way of shattering to pieces or pouring into the stratosphere or sinking into the depths of the sea materials which might otherwise be used to make the masses too comfortable and hence in the long run too intelligent. In practice, the needs of the population are always underestimated, with the result that there is a chronic shortage of half the necessities of life. But this is looked on as an advantage. It is deliberate policy to keep even the favored groups somewhere near the brink of hardship, because a general state of scarcity increases the importance of small privileges and thus magnifies the distinction between one group and another. The social atmosphere is that of a besieged city, where the possessions of a lump of horseflesh makes the difference between wealth and poverty. And at the same time, the consequences of being at war, and therefore in danger, makes the handing over of all our power to a small caste seem the natural, unavoidable condition of survival. War, it will be seen, not only accomplishes the necessary destruction, but accomplishes it in a psychologically acceptable way. In principle, it would be quite simple to waste the surplus labor of the world by building temples and pyramids, by digging holes and filling them up again, or even by producing vast quantities of goods and then setting fire to them. But this would provide only the economic and not the emotional basis for a hierarchical society. War, it will be seen, is now a purely internal affair, waged by each ruling group against its own subjects, and the object of the war is not to make or prevent conquests of territory, but to keep the structure of society intact, close quote. The goal is to provide the conditions for government by an elite group. The battle cry of several hundred years continues, quote, "Out of chaos will come order," close quote. Like a mathematical model that only has one correct answer, the ruling elite use war, famine, and disorder to rule as they please. Chaos is now scientifically created. With no allegiances, they desire to be masters of the universe, loyal to no ideology but control. Iron Mountain outlined the methods to overtake America, with the population never knowing how it happened. If the people are quietly lulled to sleep and given great prosperity at the same time, control is fairly easy. The nature of the game is control. Chapter 3, Hope of the Wicked. And no wonder, for Satan himself transforms himself into an angel of light. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 14. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. In studying the teachings of any new religion or cult, it is always wise to take a look at the founder of that religion. One would hope to discover a life that is at least somewhat consistent with the founder's teachings. Madame Blavatsky's life seems to be a perfect match with her teachings, which are found in the volumes of material she wrote. She's been described by various biographers as, quote, having a relentless and very nervous temperament, one that led her into the most unheard of, ungirlish mischief. An attraction to, and at the same time fear of, the dead. Her passionate love and curiosity for anything unknown, mysterious, weird, and fantastical. Close quote. Quote, from her earliest youth, she attracted the attention of all with whom she came in contact. She rebelled against all discipline, recognized no master but her own goodwill and her personal tastes. Close quote. Quote, she was one of the most evil and immoral women who ever lived, with personal duplicity and profound contempt for humanity. Close quote. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, heralded as the mother of the modern New Age movement, was born on August 12, 1831 in Russia and died in 1891. Her mother died when she was 11 years old, and from that time on, she was passed back and forth between her father and other relatives, for it seemed that no one could manage her. As her mother was dying, she was heard to comment, quote, ah, well, perhaps it is best that I am dying, so at least I shall be spared seeing what befalls Helena. Of one thing I am certain, her life will not be as that of other women, close quote. As a child, she was known to converse with animals and birds, and to frighten the other children with terrible and captivating stories. From an early age, she demonstrated the abilities of a medium, and, while in a trance, frequently saw the majestic figure of a Hindu in a white turban. She called him her protector, and believed that he saved her from danger on many occasions. She later described an alleged face-to-face meeting with that same master in England at the age of 20, when he instructed her to leave for India to reorganize the Theosophical Society. She was known for her violent temper and her ability to swear in several languages. This behavior was no doubt intensified as a result of her drug addiction to hashish. She acquired the name Blavatsky at the age of 17 when she married an elderly general as a result of a dare from a governess who challenged her to, quote-unquote, find any man who would be her husband in view of her temper and disposition. The marriage lasted 3 months, at which time Helena deserted him and ran away to begin a life of world travel in service to her master. Of all this, she stated, quote, I wouldn't be a slave to God himself, let alone any man. Woman finds her happiness in the acquisition of supernatural powers. Love is but a vile dream, a nightmare, close quote. She traveled all over the world, lecturing and practicing the occult, but her greatest impact by far was through her writings. Many of her beliefs can be found in 2 thick volumes entitled Isis Unveiled, and her work, The Secret Doctrine, one of the foundational occult works of all time. Her preeminently wicked book made no distinction between the serpent and the God of the Bible, and taught that Satan was the one who made man into a god. Quote, once the key to Genesis is in our hands, the scientific and symbolical Kabbalah unveils the secret. The great serpent of the Garden of Eden and the Lord God are identical, close quote. She continues saying, quote, thus Satan, once he ceases to be viewed in the superstitious, dogmatic, unphilosophical spirit of the churches, grows into the grandiose image of one who makes of a terrestrial a divine man. I'm going to read that again. Quote, thus Satan, once he ceases to be viewed in the superstitious, dogmatic, unphilosophical spirit of the churches, grows into the grandiose image of the one who makes of a terrestrial a divine man. Close quote. This material was allegedly dictated to her through her masters, who were called by various names of Kuthumi, Moria, and simply the ascended masters of wisdom. These masters were, she believed, more highly evolved souls who, after going through numerous reincarnations, had left the earth plane and were now guiding mankind. If we look at what the masters have taught the world through theosophy, we find that they have, quote, depersonalized God and created various planes of spiritual progression culminating in universal salvation and recognition through reincarnation, the wheel concept of progression borrowed unblushingly from Buddhism. Close quote. Quote, God and man are the two faces of the one eternal life and consciousness that constitutes our universe. This conception makes man a part of God, having potentially within him all the attributes and powers of the Supreme Being. It is the concept that nothing exists except God, and that humanity is one portion of him, one phase of his being. If the idea of the immanence of God is sound, then man is a literal fragment of the consciousness of the Supreme Being, is an embryo God being destined to ultimately evolve his latent powers into perfect expression. It is the unqualified assertion that humanity is part of God as, I'm going to read that again. It is the unqualified assertion that humanity is a part of God as leaves are part of the tree. Not something a tree has created in the sense that a man creates a machine, but something that is an emanation of the tree and is a living part of it. Humanity is a growth, a development, an emanation, an evolutionary expression of the Supreme Being. Close quote. If Lucifer were going to use a mortal person as a channel to discredit the Bible and weaken the Christian faith, what teachings would he most want to discredit? Let's take a look at Isis Unveiled to see what he had to say through Madame Blavatsky. Quote, like Buddha and Jesus, Apollonius was the uncompromising enemy of all outward show of piety, all display of uselessness. Quote, like Buddha and Jesus, Apollonius was the uncompromising enemy of all outward show of piety, all display of useless religious ceremonies and hypocrisy. If, like the Christian Savior, the sage of Tyana had by preference sought the companionship of the poor and humble, and instead of dying comfortably at the age of over 100 years of age, he had been a voluntary martyr proclaiming divine truth from a cross, his blood might have proved as efficacious for the subsequent dissemination of spiritual doctrines as that of the Christian Messiah. Close quote. The following statement appears on page 10 of Isis Unveiled. Quote, how could a missionary in such circumstances meet the surprise and questions of his pupils unless he may point to that seed and tell them what Christianity was meant to be? Unless he may show that, like all other religions, Christianity too has had its history, that the Christianity of the 19th century is not the Christianity of the Middle Ages, and the Christianity of the Middle Ages was not that of the early councils, and the Christianity of the early councils was not that of the apostles, and that what has been said by Christ, that alone was well said. Close quote. With one stroke of the pen, Blavatsky and her masters do away with over 2/3 of the New Testament. The New Age movement of today strangely believes in the religion of Jesus, not in Jesus. New Agers believe that we can all attain Christ consciousness, becoming gods ourselves. The leaders of the New Age movement have also found a friend within the confines of the Masonic lodges. In the last 2 centuries, Freemasonry and the New Age movement beat as one heart. The Scottish Rite Journal of the Southern Jurisdiction was previously called the New Age magazine between 1903 and 1990. Freemason Lynn F. Perkins wrote a book in 1972 titled New Age Youth and Masonry, what every high school and college graduate should know about Masonry. The book was dedicated to those of oncoming generations of youth who would build and operate the new order of the ages. He also wrote another book called Masonry in the New Age. The Theosophical Society. Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine and the organization she helped to found, the Theosophical Society, have certainly had an impact on our culture. The Secret Doctrine was the first book that Sirhan Sirhan requested after he was jailed for the murder of Robert F. Kennedy. Adolf Hitler kept a copy of the Secret Doctrine at his bedside and was profoundly influenced by it. Hitler was a disciple of Madame Blavatsky and was initiated into the meaning of her secret doctrines. He was tutored by men who were formerly theosophists themselves and had theosophists at his side until the very end of the war. This favorite book of Adolf Hitler's was also a favorite of Freemasonry's greatest philosopher, 33rd degree Mason Manly P. Hall. Hall spoke with unrestrained praise for Blavatsky's writings. Quote, "The Secret Doctrine and Isis Unveiled are Madame Blavatsky's gifts to humanity, and to those whose vision can pierce the meaning, and to those whose vision can pierce the menacing clouds of imminent disaster, it is no exaggeration to confirm that these writings are the most vital literary contribution to the modern world. No more can they be compared with other books than can the light of the sun be compared with the lamp of the glowworm. The Secret Doctrine assumes the dignity of a scripture." Close quote. Blavatsky's organization, the Theosophical Society, was founded in 1875. Freemason Henry Steele Olcott was the president, with Freemason George H. Felt as vice president, and high-ranking American Mason Charles Southern as a member. He also among the early members was the most powerful American Mason of all time, Albert Pike, Grand Commander of the Scottish Rite. Madame Blavatsky was such a favorite of Freemasons that she was issued a Masonic certificate in the ancient and primitive rite of Masonry in 1877. Disciples. In 1907, Annie Besant became the head of the Theosophical Society. Besant continues Blavatsky's love for Masonry by becoming a leader and earning the 33rd degree in co-Masonry in order with rites that admitted women as well as men. On February 19th, 1922, an alliance between Mrs. Besant's co-Masonry and the Grand Orient of France was celebrated at the Grand Temple of Droit Humain in Paris. During the time Annie Besant was head of the Theosophical Society, she labored to promote a young man from India, her adopted son Jiddu Krishnamurti, as the Messiah. Her right-hand man in this endeavor was 33rd degree Mason C.W. Leadbeater. This Freemason had a passionate desire for the deeper workings of the occult. Some sources claim Leadbeater was a pedophile homosexual. When the dark side of Freemasonry begins to be revealed and discussed, the question invariably arises: does participation in Masonic rituals lead to demonic invasion and control? C.W. Leadbeater answers that question for us most decisively from an insider's point of view. Leadbeater does more than give an affirmative answer to our question. He proceeds to describe the demonic spirits he received in various degrees of Freemasonry. Quote, "The 30th degree brings its angel as well, appropriately a great blue diva of the first ray who lends his strength to the knight KH, somewhat as the crimson angel assists the X and perf bro and the Rose Croix, CROIX. The 33rd degree gives two such splendid fellow workers, spirits of gigantic size as compared to humanity, and radiantly white in color. The 33rd degree links the sovereign Grand Inspector General with the spiritual king of the world himself. the mightiest of adepts, who stands at the head of the great white lodge, in whose strong hands lie the destinies of earth. Yet when one of these bright spirits is attached to us by the Masonic ceremony, we must not think of him either as a director or as an attendant, but simply as a co-worker and a brother. Close quote. The occult world has a language unto itself. Alice Ann Bailey and the Tibetan KAL-EL, K-H-U-L. Alice Bailey is probably the most influential person involved in laying the foundation of the New Age movement. By the time she had finished her work in 1949, she had established Lucis Trust, World Goodwill, Triangles, the Arcane School, and the New Group of World Servers. She wrote 24 books, a total of 10,469 pages, most of which were allegedly written through her by her spirit guide, the Tibetan KAL-EL, K-H-U-L. Bailey was extremely anti-Jewish and anti-Christian, and was a far more powerful force to be reckoned with than most people realize or would care to admit. Lucis Trust, an organization which Bailey originally founded in the 1920s under the name Lucifer Publishing Company, today boasts a membership of approximately 6,000 people. Some of the world's most renowned financial and political leaders have belonged to this organization, including individuals such as Robert McNamara, Donald Reagan, Henry Kissinger, David Rockefeller, Paul Volcker, George Shultz. This is the same group of people that runs the Council on Foreign Relations, or the CFR, the organization responsible for founding and developing the United Nations. It is interesting to note that until recently, the Lucis Trust was headquartered at United Nations Plaza. Alice Ann Bailey was born of high social standing in Manchester, England on June 6, 1880. Although her parents both died when she was young, she wanted for nothing and was raised by relatives in a protective environment. As a young woman, she spent a number of years in Christian work. It can become a tiresome experience to work in Christian service without the indwelling power of the Holy Spirit, and Alice soon burned out. All alone in a strange country with 3 young daughters after a difficult and painful marriage, she was ripe for the same deceptive forces that had used Helena Blavatsky in establishing the Theosophical Society. These forces first contacted her through 2 English ladies who lived in Pacific Grove, California. They came from the same social background in England as Alice and were deeply involved in the occult teachings of theosophy. Bitter over an abusive marriage and confused about her purpose in life, Alice began a metamorphosis that transformed her into a master teacher of the occult and one of the most receptive channels of demonic influence the world had yet known. Of this period, she states, quote, "I sat up in bed reading the secret doctrine at night and began to neglect reading my Bible, which I had been in the habit of doing. My mind woke up as I struggled with the presented ideas and sought to fit my own beliefs and the new concepts together. I discovered, first of all, that there is a great and divine plan. I found that race after race of human beings had appeared and disappeared upon our planet, and that each civilization and culture had seen humanity step forward a little further upon the path of return to God. I discovered, for the second thing, that there are those who are responsible for working out of the plan and who, step by step and stage by stage, have led mankind on down the centuries. I made the amazing discovery, amazing to me because I knew so little, that the teaching about this path or this plan was uniform, whether it was presented in the Occident or the Orient, or whether it had emerged prior to the coming of Christ or afterwards. I learned that when I, in my Orthodox days, talked about Christ and his church, I was really speaking of Christ and the planetary... Blah, blah, blah. I learned that when I, in my Orthodox days, talked about Christ and his church, I was really speaking of Christ and the planetary hierarchy, close quote. Of these Orthodox days, she writes, quote, all this time I was steadily and forcefully preaching the old-time religion. I remained appallingly orthodox, or, to use the more modern word, an unthinking fundamentalist. For no fundamentalist uses his mind, close quote. After Bailey rejected the Christ of Calvary, she was willing to embrace a preternatural occult belief system. This allowed her to be used for 30 years as a channel for transmitting all that the forces of darkness desired humanity to accept as truth. She died on December 15th, 1949, just 30 days after the Tibetan had finished writing through her. Apparently, her usefulness to the hierarchy of evil was at an end. Alice and Foster Bailey. Alice A. Bailey was the reigning queen of the New Age movement until her death. She wrote over 20 books with the help of her spirit guide, the Tibetan master Kejwal Kul. Mrs. Bailey spoke plainly and truthfully about the fact that the Masonic Lodge was the training school for the leaders of the occult world. She said of Freemasonry, quote, it is a far more occult organization than can be realized, and is intended to be the training school for the coming advanced occultists, close quote. Together with her husband, 32nd degree Mason Foster Bailey, Alice Bailey labored to bring in the reign of the New Age Christ. Foster states that, quote, the most important reorientation in the hierarchy is the united focus on preparation for the reappearance of the Christ among men, close quote. And, quote, the Christ is a living man today. He is a great world executive and is actively working to help humanity to grow up spiritually, but not seeking or wanting to control us, close quote. Furthermore, Foster points out that, quote, the Christ and the hierarchy are focused on the New Age actions, and when externalized, will use New Age techniques, close quote. Foster Bailey also ridiculed the Christ of the Bible and heralded the false gospel of New Age Christ, saying, quote, the Christian doctrine that he comes as a Christian to save us from hell and for some distant judgment date is a hangover from humanity's childhood days. He does not come to save us, but to help us save ourselves, close quote. Foster Bailey wrote articles for Masonic magazines and lectured at Masonic lodge halls. His book, The Spirit of Masonry, is still sold in the McCoy Publishing and Masonic Supply Company catalog. It is sobering to read in his book how powerful New Age leader this powerful New Age leader spoke of Masonry as the universal religion. Quote, it is not possible from a contemplation of this side of Masonic teaching that may provide all that is necessary for the formulation of a universal religion. May it not be true. It is sobering to read in his book how this powerful New Age leader spoke of Masonry as the universal religion. Quote, is it not possible from a contemplation of this side of Masonic teaching that it may provide all that is necessary for the formulation of a universal religion? May it not be true, as has been said, that if all religions and scriptures were blotted out and only Masonry were left in the world, we could still recover the great plan of salvation? Most earnestly should all true Masons consider this point. A revitalized Masonry made up of Masons true to their obligations and realizing the mystic tie that binds them all together in one true brotherhood would also provide a platform so universal that it would meet the need of thinkers of all kinds and every school of thought. It would thus not only meet a religious need by providing a universal religion, but would also satisfy the mental need felt by all broad-minded thinkers of this time, close quote. Aleister Crowley, father of modern Satanism. The most disturbing example of someone being recruited out of Freemasonry into more bizarre occult orders is that of 33rd degree Mason Aleister Crowley. During his lifetime, Crowley was proclaimed by the press as the most wicked man alive and was indeed possessed by Satan. Crowley's perverted life left a string of casualties among those who were foolish enough to get close to this evil man. Crowley's first wife, Rose, entered an insane asylum in 1911. His second wife, Maria, entered an asylum in 1931, 2 years after her marriage to Crowley. In a locked room with only Crowley and his son present, Crowley performed a ritual in which his son died. On a London street in 1934, a 19-year-old girl rushed up to him and declared that she wanted to have his baby. Crowley took her to bed. She too later entered an asylum. A brief autobiographical sketch of Crowley's life is like an evening swim in a sewer. Crowley called himself the Beast 666, and Layla Waddell, his mistress, displayed the mark of the beast tattooed between her breasts. If there ever were a man that was more wicked than Crowley, it would be hard to imagine. Crowley was a homosexual and a drug addict that opposed Christianity with hatred that was frightening. He said, quote, "To me, every dirty act was simply a sacrament of sin, a passionately religious protest against Christianity, which was for me a symbol of all vileness, meanness, treachery, falsehood, and oppression," close quote. Ordo Templi Orientis and Freemason Theodore Roos. One of the most alarming things about Crowley's life was the way that he went from Freemasonry into the occult, Ordo Templi Orientis, OTO. Crowley tells us in his own words how Freemason Theodore Roos, R-E-U-S-S, recruited him into the OTO. Quote, "Although I was admitted to the 33rd and last degree of Freemasonry so long ago as 1900, it was not until the summer of 1912 that my suspicion was confirmed. I speak of my belief that behind the frivolities and convivialities, whatever the hell, of our greatest institution lay in truth a secret, ineffable, and miraculous, potent to control the forces of nature, and not only to make men brethren, but to make them divine. At the time I speak of, a man by the name of Theodore Roos, R-E-U-S-S, who came to me, a man of those mysterious masters of esoteric Freemasonry who are alike its eyes and brains, who exist in its midst unknown, often even to its acknowledged chiefs. This man had been watching my occult career for some years and had deemed me now worthy to partake in the greater mysteries," close quote. Aleister Crowley proudly called his cult of the OTO, quote-unquote, true Freemasonry. Quote, "I claim for my system that it satisfies all possible requirements of true Freemasonry. It offers a rational basis for universal brotherhood and for universal religion," close quote. How close is the connection between Freemasonry and the OTO? Masonic historian Francis King reveals a closer connection than Freemasons would ever dare to admit. Quote, "For the OTO not only had connections with spurious and clandestine Masonic groups, but functioned as a recruiting office for one of these. In the classification of members by degrees, appended to Roos's document is clearly stated that, quote, candidates are made Freemasons by the directing members, fratres superiores, of the OTO, close quote. The fact that Crowley was head of the OTO while holding the rank of 33rd degree Mason should forever explode the myth that Freemasonry is a Christian organization. Crowley spoke openly and candidly about his Masonic honors. Quote, "This view was confirmed when the arcane schools of John Yarker came to me for review. I wrote to the author, who recognized my title to the 33rd degree and conferred on me the grades of 95th degree Memphis and the 90th degree Mizraim. It seemed as if I had somehow turned a tap. From this time on, I lived in a perfect shower of diplomas from Bucharest to Salt Lake City. I possessed more exalted titles than I have ever been able to count. I am supposed to know more secret signs, tokens, passwords, grand words, grips, and so on than I could actually learn in a dozen lives. An elephant would break down under the insignia that I am entitled to wear." Close quote. In the Confessions of Aleister Crowley, Crowley spoke with great admiration about the Royal Ark degree. Quote, "I suppose myself to have reached the summit of success when I restored the secret word of the Royal Ark. In this case, tradition had preserved the word almost intact." Close quote. It is perfectly understandable that this hater of Christianity would have the royal... It is perfectly understandable that this hater of Christianity would love the Royal Ark degree of Freemasonry. In this degree, Freemasons blaspheme the God of the Bible by uniting God's name with pagan gods. The secret word of the Royal Ark that Crowley is referring to is Jabulan. The Jah or the Yah represents Jehovah, Bul represents the pagan god Baal, and An represents the Egyptian god of the sun. It is no wonder Crowley's satanic heart jumped for joy when he was able to blaspheme the God of the Bible by uniting the true God with the pagan god Baal, to whom human children were sacrificed. The following quote came from Crowley's Magic in Theory and Practice will forever. The following quote from Crowley's book Magic in Theory and Practice will further prove how evil he was. Quote, "For the highest spiritual working, one must accordingly choose that victim which contains the greatest and purest force. A male child of perfect innocence and high intelligence is the most satisfactory and suitable victim. But the bloody sacrifice, though more dangerous, is more efficacious. And for nearly all purposes, human sacrifice is the best. In sacrifice during invocation, however, it may be said without fear of contradiction that the death of the victim should coincide with the supreme invocation." Close quote. Eliphaz Levi and Alvord Pike. Eliphaz Levi became a Freemason on March 14th, 1861, and authored many books that have become classics in occult literature. Many things could be said about Eliphaz Levi, but the information we are dwelling on here is the Luciferian doctrine that Levi passed on to another Freemason of great repute, Albert Pike. Pike was the Grand Commander of the Scottish Rite from 1859 to 1891, and has been called by many the most powerful and influential American Mason of all time. Pike is buried at the Masonic Temple on the corner of 16th and R Streets in Washington, D.C., several blocks from the White House. His book, Morals and Dogma, which was published by the Supreme Council, is still a Masonic classic. Levi thought of Lucifer not as a person, but as a force. The pantheistic god of the New Age movement, the great magical agent that could be used for good or evil. He explains, quote, "They have said that the great magical agent, accurately termed Lucifer because it is the vehicle of light and the receptacle of all forms, is a mediating force diffused throughout creation." Close quote. In the Luciferian doctrine of Eliphaz Levi, Satan or Lucifer was not evil in the craft sense. They were just another side of Levi's pantheistic God. Quote, "Thus Satan is not the ruler of the realm of shadow. He is the agent of light behind a veil. He is of service to God. He performs God's work. God has not rejected him, for he holds him still in his hand. What is the devil then in the final analysis? The devil is God working evil. Close quote. Albert Pike teaches the same Luciferian doctrine in what is probably the most widely used and honored Masonic book of all time, Morals and Dogma. Quote, the true name of Satan, the Kabbalists say, is that of Yahweh reversed. For Satan is not a black God, but the negation of God. The devil is the personification of atheism or idolatry. For the initiates, this is not a person, but a force created for good, which may serve for evil. It is the instrument of liberty or free will. They represent this force, which presides over the physical generation under the mythologic and horned form of the god Pan. Thence came the he-goat of the Sabbat, the brother of the ancient serpent, the light-bearer or the phosphor, of which the poets have made the false Lucifer of the legend. Close quote. Most Freemasons don't know that the passage above is a direct quote from page 161 of the History of Magic by Master Occultist Eliphaz Levi. Albert Pike speaks once again about Lucifer the Light-Bearer in Morals and Dogma. Quote, Lucifer the Light-Bearer, strange and mysterious name to give to the spirit of darkness. Lucifer, the son of the morning. Is it he who bears the light, and with his splendors intolerable blinds feeble, sensual, or selfish souls? I'm going to read that again. Lucifer, the light bearer, strange and mysterious name to give to the spirit of darkness. Lucifer, the son of the morning. Is it he who bears the light, and with its splendors intolerable blinds feeble, sensual, or selfish souls? Doubt it not. Once again, few Freemasons realize that Albert Pike is quoting directly from page 36 of the History of Magic by Eliphaz Levi. The fact that Albert Pike takes his Luciferian doctrine directly from the occultist Freemason Eliphaz Levi is not a coincidence. The ascended masters, in their own words, the spiritual hierarchy of the earth is the aggregate of those of humanity who have triumphed over matter, who have achieved the goal of self-mastery by the same path that individuals tread today. They are no longer centered in the individual consciousness, but have entered into the wider realization of the planetary group life. They work according to plan and are known as the custodians of the plan, close quote. In other words, they claim to be a group of highly evolved human beings who, having experienced the process of reincarnation, watch over and guide the progress of humanity. The senior members of the hierarchy are the masters of wisdom. A master of wisdom is one who has, through self-mastery, achieved mastery over the whole field of human evolution. Having done so, his understanding is no longer limited or bound by the human kingdom, but also encompasses that kingdom of pure consciousness termed the kingdom of souls. Because of an individual natural predisposition to certain lines of work, each has a special contribution to make towards human progress in one of the 7 major fields of work: political, religious, educational, scientific, philosophical, psychological, or economic. From the state of our world today, it looks as if they have been quite busy. However, their success seems to be more in creating chaos than in bringing about progress. New Age occultists refer to these spirits by a variety of names, including spirit guide, master, enlightened one, adept, initiated adept, hierarchy of initiates, spiritual hierarchy of the earth, planetary hierarchy, the hierarchy, custodians of the plan. As previously stated by Blavatsky, the most powerful or highest ranking members of this so-called hierarchy are known as ascended masters of wisdom. More typically, they are referred to as masters of wisdom, ascended masters, the Tibetan masters, or simply masters. All are references to the same thing. The general understanding among New Agers is that these beings are humans who have gone through numerous cycles of reincarnation, evolving to a higher level of spiritual perfection each time. Some occultists believe that these creatures physically walk the earth and are concentrated in the region of the Himalayas, Tibet, Nepal, and Western China. Others believe that these quote-unquote more highly evolved beings exist on a spiritual plane, being accessible only through occult meditation. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. In studying the writings of a wide variety of New Age political and spiritual leaders, one name is praised over and over again. That name is Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. His concepts and teachings run like a continuous thread through an intricate tapestry of today's New Age spiritual beliefs. The imprint of his thinking is on the minds of individuals who have rejected the God of the Bible for a God who's nothing more than quote-unquote energy that flows through the sum of all creation. The circle of Chardin's influence continues to widen even after his death, for not only did he write a number of widely read volumes, but many of his disciples have their works on the bestseller lists. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was born on May 1st, 1881 in Sarcenant, France. He came from a traditional Catholic family, the fourth out of 11 children. His father, Emmanuel, took pleasure in teaching his children how to understand and appreciate natural history. So it is easy to understand how he became interested in the study of geology at an early age. He became a Jesuit priest, but instead of shepherding a parish or following some other religious work, he always pursued his first love, which was the blending of the physical and the spiritual worlds under the banner of quote-unquote evolution. Teilhard was a pantheist despite his protests to the contrary. A pantheist is one who sees the universe as the one and only reality and calls this God, whether it be a llama, a rock, or an unwed mother needing financial help. Individual human beings are only phases or sparks of that greater reality. According to his theology, the earth itself, as well as man, is divine. Many of Teilhard's statements reflect this view of existence. He speaks about loving, adoring, and serving the earth, in the same way many Christians speak about loving God. For Teilhard, Christ was the quote-unquote true soul of the world representing his body and flesh. In his book, The Future of Man, he says, quote, "We cannot continue to love Christ without discovering him more and more. The maturing of a collective consciousness accompanied by numerical expansions. There are two aspects inseparably linked to the historical unfolding of incarnation. Without the process of biological evolution, which produced the human brain, there would be no sanctified souls. And similarly, without the evolution of collective thought, through which alone the plenitude of human consciousness can be attained on earth, how can there be a consummated Christ?" Close quote. According to Teilhard's concept of evolution, at one time God was not highly evolved enough to express himself through human consciousness. This was during the prehistoric period, when God could only express himself through animals. So in other words, evolution is simply man and God becoming conscious of himself. And Christ in this scheme is incarnate in the entire universe. Christ in his cosmic or universal nature overshadows Christ in his human nature. Quote, "Christ is above all the God of evolution." Quote, Christ is above all the God of evolution. He is its center, its alpha and omega, beginning and end. He is the omega point, the supreme summit of the evolutionary movement in which he is immersed and which superanimates. As God, the evolver, he is the director, the leader, the cause and mover of evolution. Christ is also evolving into a super Christ. Humanity is the highest phase so far of evolution, but evolution is beginning to change into a superhumanity, which at its peak becomes the omega point, close quote. Teilhard de Chardin's theology diverged so far from biblical teaching in 1957. Teilhard de Chardin's theology diverged so far from biblical teaching that in 1957, the Holy See decreed that his works must be withdrawn from libraries, seminaries, and religious institutions. In 1962, the office issued a further warning to bishops, rectors of seminaries, and presidents of universities to protect the minds of the faithful against the heresies of Teilhard's teachings. However, this did not put an end to the influence of this French priest's paleontologist philosopher. Today, he is praised in progressive Catholic circles as a great religious thinker and a scientific genius. His influence goes far beyond Catholic circles, as evidenced by the fact that he is the most widely read author in the New Age movement. In New Age, occult bookstores, there's badly placed commas here, bad editing. In New Age occultic bookstores, there is often a display of bookmarks near the cash register with about 10 people pictured on them. Chardin is one of them. In the book The Aquarian Conspiracy, Marilyn Ferguson, arguably the most important and comprehensive modern work on the New Age movement, there are at least 16 different references to Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. A December 1999 poll on the internet asking readers for the most influential men of the 20th century placed Chardin in the top 5. Trilateralist Zbigniew Brzezinski appears to be another follower of Chardin. In his book Between Two Ages, he quotes Chardin, quote, monstrous as it is it not modern totalitarianism? Shit. In his book Between Two Ages, he quotes Chardin, quote, monstrous as it is not modern totalitarianism really the distortion of something magnificent and thus quite near to the truth, close quote. The New Age movement and all of the isms which preceded it are examples of man looking for answers in all the wrong places. There are those who formally invite Satan into their lives, sanitize this act through philosophical writings, and in time lead nations and generations astray. These are the real false prophets whose impact is truly significant. The name of the game is control.